Indonesia has become crucial to the world's technological future. And the worst part is that it's now playing with fire. This archipelago controls almost 50% of the world's nickel. Nickel is essential for manufacturing high-capacity batteries, which power everything from your cell phone to a Tesla. That's why Indonesia has become a pawn in the game between China, the United States, and Europe. Now, the interesting thing is not what it has, but how it has decided to use it. The president has a plan with an epic name, Indonesia's Golden Vision, which aims to turn the archipelago into a developed country by 2045. And the way to achieve this is very simple. You want my nickel? Perfect. Before I sell it to you, you'll have to set up factories in my country. If not, you'll be left without batteries. At first, it seemed like economic suicide. Production plummeted, markets panicked, and more than one executive at Tesla or Volkswagen must have choked on their coffee. But the move worked. In just one decade, Indonesia has gone from being a simple exporter of raw materials to a refining giant, 36 smelters where there were previously none. And in regions such as Konawe, GDP is growing at 22% per year. To give you an idea, this figure is more than 4 times higher than China's economic growth. Of course, every miracle comes at a price. Indonesia has attracted billions in investment thanks to tax breaks and lax regulations. So lax that any environmental concerns have been pushed into the background. Open pit mines, polluted rivers, displaced communities. The new emerging dragon is beginning to look like a colossus with feet of clay. And this raises the big question. Is the nickel gamble working? Or is it a mirage? Could Indonesia become the new Asian dragon thanks to this unusual way of encouraging investment? And most importantly, what will all this mean for global technological development? Let's get into it. Nickel. It's not a rare earth element or anything like that, but without it, the modern world would grind to a halt. It's used to manufacture stainless steel and, above all, several types of batteries that are widely used in electric vehicles. In 2024 alone, electric car sales skyrocketed by 25% compared to the previous year. In short, nickel is crucial. And guess who holds the key to this treasure? That's right, Indonesia. With 40% of the world's reserves, mainly in the form of limonite, this archipelago has become one of the biggest beneficiaries of the energy transition. But of course, there's a catch. Because in the game of strategic metals, the real prize is not in extracting the ore, but in refining it. And in this regard, China is playing on home turf. To give you an idea, between 70% and 90% of the nickel that left Indonesia ended up in Chinese factories. The result? They got the lion's share, and Indonesia got the crumbs. Until one day, Jakarta said, enough is enough. And this is where many of you are probably thinking, okay, I'm sure they'll now do what the petromonarchies do, use the money from nickel to diversify the economy. Well, no. Nothing could be further from the truth. Indonesia didn't let go of nickel, it embraced it even more tightly. In 2009, it forced all foreign mining companies to sell 51% of their shares to local companies. And take note, because this is just the appetizer of what was to come. 5 years after that first show of force, Indonesia went all in. It banned the export of its natural resources. The immediate result? Disaster. Production plummeted, and the government, with a look of, well, maybe it wasn't the right time, lifted the ban. But in 2017, they pressed the red button again, and this time, bingo, production took off like a SpaceX rocket. But the significant thing is not that mines and excavators are working flat out, but what happens to that mineral afterwards. Previously, Indonesian nickel ended up in Chinese factories. Now it is processed at home. The result? The share of refined nickel made in Indonesia has more than doubled, from 2% to 9% of total exports. And incidentally, Indonesia is now the world's largest producer of stainless steel. A fact worth noting, in 2014, the year of the ban, there were 0 smelters. In 2023, there were 36. Of course, this was a risky gamble. The mining companies could have left for other countries, but they didn't. They preferred to invest in refineries, infrastructure, and factories within the archipelago. Why? 2 compelling reasons. Number 1. Indonesia is irreplaceable. Okay, it has only 40% of the world's reserves, but they are much more concentrated than in other places. And although some of that nickel was in tricky places, such as the seabed, Chinese companies have developed techniques to make it accessible and cheap to mine. Today, this archipelago has economies of scale that no one can compete with. And number 2, Indonesia has known to pamper investors. It forces them to sell 51% of their operations to local companies. Yes, but in exchange, it gave them tax breaks, tailor-made regulations, and environmental criteria. That's for poor Europeans. In Jakarta, the mantra is clear. We're here to boost GDP, not to plant daisies. And boy, has GDP risen. Konawe, one of the districts that has benefited most from nickel. This region has gone from growing 6% to 22% each year. By comparison, China is currently growing at around 5%. And although the country as a whole is still some way off its target of 8% annual growth, it is undeniable that the export ban has radically changed the country's economy. Furthermore, the Indonesian government has not stood idly by and already has a plan to deepen the economic transformation. The past was nickel mining. The present is nickel refining, and the future will be to take advantage of all this to manufacture increasingly complex products with greater added value. What product are they thinking of? Well, it's clear. It can only be one: electric vehicles. And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. Foreign investment in electric vehicles is growing strongly, although it's still relatively small. Along with that, investment in batteries is booming, and mining and mineral refining are not far behind, an ideal recipe for success. Or at least, that was the idea. Because unfortunately for Indonesia, electric cars are not quite taking off. Yes, it's still early days. Bear in mind that Indonesia already has the second largest vehicle production capacity in Southeast Asia, with a very strong commitment to electric vehicles. The result? In 2023, 17,000 electric vehicles were sold, less than half of what the government promised, and even fewer than Vietnam or Thailand, much smaller countries. To give you an idea, Thailand has 4 times fewer people, but sells 3 times more cars. Of course, here we're counting both electric and combustion vehicles. It's true that giants like BYD are already getting involved, for example, with a factory capable of producing 150,000 vehicles a year. But take note, the government's goal is not to become Asia's cheap parts workshop, but to create a powerful national industry bearing the Made in Indonesia label. And right now, there are barely 2 models that are at least 40% locally produced. So the question many of you are probably wondering is, if things were going so well before, what went wrong? Well, surprise, the question is misleading. Because no, things weren't going well before. So far, we've told you about the bright side of the nickel gamble, the data that the government proudly repeats at all international summits. But the rest of the evidence is hard to ignore. The nickel strategy has been a failure. It has not improved the lives of Indonesians, nor is it creating the basis for more advanced industries. Want to know why? Okay, let's open up the toolbox and see what's broken here. Earlier, we saw that economic growth in districts with more nickel was taking off, but this has not translated into higher wages and lower unemployment. As you can see, poverty remains exactly the same as before GDP took off. And when we talk about Konawe, we're also talking about Morowali, another big beneficiary, or any other district with nickel. If we compare them with the rest of the country, we see no difference. Despite all the government's policies, more than 70% of the profits from nickel continue to flow into the pockets of foreign investors. And the remaining 30%? Well, that part does stay at home, but not exactly in the civilian sector. You'd be surprised at how many ministers and other senior officials have business dealings with nickel mining companies. You know what I mean. But come on, it's no mystery. In the end, the pie is divided according to the value that each person brings, and banning exports, on its own, is not exactly a driver of value creation. You've seen the outcome. Yes, Indonesia produces more complex products, but it's not seeing the profits that usually come with that. The move was clear. Jakarta told the multinationals, if you want my nickel, invest here. And the multinationals responded, perfect. You want smelters? Here are smelters. Refineries? As many as you want. But, in exchange, almost all the profits go to me. So the tug of war turned out to be much tighter than the government had imagined. And that is only talking about nickel. Its crown jewel, the natural resource over which it had the most market power. What we haven't told you yet is that Indonesia tried to apply the same formula to other minerals, such as bauxite, from which aluminium is extracted. The result? A resounding failure. and this time without any nuances. Nickel prices skyrocketed following the 2020 ban. It's true that it was already trending upward, but that trend was one of recovery, not new growth. Bauxite production, on the other hand, plummeted, and the explanation is very simple. Indonesia does not have a monopoly on this particular mineral. This misstep has cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars in losses and worsened the trade balance by the order of billions. Two clear lessons can be drawn from this case. First, Indonesia attracted investment in nickel because it had monopoly power, not because it was the most efficient place on the planet to produce it. Second, now you understand why we're not very optimistic about electric cars. If you have a monopoly on nickel, it's relatively easy to also take over nickel refining, even if it's not as profitable as it first appeared. But with something as complex as an electric vehicle, where nickel represents only a tiny fraction of the cost, the story changes. If Indonesia wants to become a technological superpower, it needs to use all this investment to become more productive. So what's the problem? We've already seen that the profits go abroad, so it won't exactly be a walk in the park. And to make matters worse, the government is not playing its best cards to industrialize. Indonesia has already failed in the automotive market once. The main reason? An old acquaintance for anyone watching us from Latin America: import substitution. That idea that in order to grow, you have to stop buying from abroad and manufacture everything at home, not just the final products, but also the intermediate goods, and even the machines. A perfect formula for remaining poor. We saw it in Latin America, and what can I say? We're witnessing a light version of it in the United States. Well, Indonesia is still hooked on this strategy. It has opened up a little more, yes, but it still dreams of creating that 100% Indonesian national champion. Remember we said earlier that only 2 car brands had more than 40% local production. That number is no coincidence. It's the legal minimum required by the government to access its giant public aid plan. The problem is that none of these subsidies solve the real obstacle, which is that Indonesians don't want these cars. And let's not even talk about the rest of the world.
Just because Indonesia has nickel doesn't mean it should make EVs. When it comes to other factors that determine where carmakers produce, such as logistical capacity and local know-how, Indonesia is less attractive than its neighbors. Given enough money and political attention, some sort of supply chain will surely end up being created, but the costs to Indonesia could vastly exceed the benefits.
And that's okay. A country doesn't need a national champion to industrialize. Look at Poland. Apart from CD Projekt, yes, the makers of The Witcher, can you name another major Polish company? Most people probably can't. And yet, the Polish miracle has been spectacular. And we're not just talking about GDP. Poverty has plummeted, and Polish consumption is growing at the same rate as their economy. In Indonesia, on the other hand, the nickel boom has failed to end poverty. And remember, the sacrifices have not been minor. It's estimated that deaths from air pollution will increase more than 20-fold between 2020 and 2030, and economic losses due to health problems and sick leave could reach $3.5 billion annually. To put that in perspective, that's half of what Indonesia currently earns from exporting refined nickel. Let's be clear, most Indonesians have no problem with exploiting their mineral deposits. The pollution is terrible, yes, but poverty is worse. Much worse. The problem is that many workers are experiencing the worst of both worlds, and not just those who go down into the mines. In many districts, even those that have benefited most from the nickel boom, farming and fishing remain the main economic activities, and pollution from mining and factories is killing these industries. Let's see how many bright sparks want to plant a vegetable garden next to an open pit mine. Yes, I know that industry sounds more attractive than agriculture, especially when we're talking about cutting-edge sectors such as electric cars. But let's not forget something important. In Indonesia, improvements in agricultural productivity have been the best weapon against poverty. And no, this is not an isolated case. The same thing happened in China. As crazy as it sounds, poverty fell more among those who continued to farm the land than among those who abandoned the countryside to move to the city. Be careful, don't jump to odd conclusions. This doesn't mean that a country should not industrialize. It means that each country has its own pace, and that a brilliant policy at a particular moment can be a disaster if the right conditions are not in place. On this channel, we've talked a lot about how India has a huge economic problem precisely because it wants to skip steps on the ladder of development. Furthermore, Indonesia was already on the right track before the government's nationalist shift. One fact, between 2000 and 2020, salaried employment rose from 37% to 50%. In poor countries, most workers are self-employed. But don't imagine Steve Jobs in a garage about to create Apple, but rather people who survive as best they can in the informal economy. Basically, they're unemployed people who cannot find a real job. That's why more salaried workers are usually a good indicator of how the economy is doing. And note that what also rose was the proportion of self-employed workers in the formal sector. That is, real entrepreneurs who create profitable businesses. Meanwhile, the proportion of undeclared self-employed workers, especially among the poorest, plummeted. In short, Indonesia was doing very well before it made a massive gamble on natural resources. A bet that, incidentally, has turned the logistics chain of other sectors upside down without delivering the promised results. And what has the government learned from this failed experiment with nickel? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. In fact, it's about to double down, and all in with even less chance of success. That said, to end on a positive note, at least this nickel fever has led the government to invest much more in science and engineering-oriented university education. And Visualeconomik community, human capital is the key to achieving sustained long-term economic growth. But at this point, it's your turn. Did you know about Indonesia's bet on nickel? Was it really as successful as the export figures suggest? Or has it not led to any improvement for ordinary workers? Will we see electric vehicles made in Indonesia on our streets in the coming years? You can leave your answers in the comments. Don't forget that here on Visualeconomik we release new videos every week, so subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. If you like this video, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. See you next time.